Hey everybody, it's Ricardo Gorski, the founder of Tax One, where we help individuals and businesses pay as little tax as legally possible. And in this video, I'm going to talk about all of the costs and fees that you will encounter when you're interested in anything regarding Cyprus. And this video is actually very important to me because I remember when I first came to Cyprus, I had no idea about what the fair prices are for a non-dom certificate, for the yellow slip, for the permanent residency, for the company formation, and anything else that you might be interested in. And so in this video, I'm not just going to give you the actual prices that the service providers, lawyers, accountants charge you, but the actual costs that these service providers have with the government. What are the real expenses and what are the margins that are basically professional fees on top of that? I mean, it's one of the most common questions, how much does this or that cost? And I just thought that I will sit down here, I will go over a literal list with all the potential services and give you the actual costs that we charge, that other service providers charge, and how much it costs us. And so before I start, I just want to let you know that a lot of service providers actually advertise with extremely low prices. And I'm talking about half the prices that we charge. But the reason behind that is because they are just giving you a front-end price and they will make up for the money that they didn't charge you in the beginning later on when they cross-sell you and upsell you services that you essentially need, but not in the beginning, later on. And this is the perfect introduction to go over the company incorporation costs first, because this is beautifully showing you what I mean. So the company formation costs for trading and holding companies are the same because there is no real distinction in the Cyprus law between a trading and a holding company. So it's the same for both. And the first thing that you need to do when you are interested in incorporating a Cyprus limited company is to get your name approved and get a stamp that is needed for stamping documents with your company name on it. And here we are talking about costs of just like 30 euros actual costs, and most service providers don't add a surplus on that. It's literally as cheap as that. And now listen carefully, because a lot of people just look at the company formation costs on the offers that they receive from various different options. And this is like a battle between the service providers, and they understand that they want to sell the company incorporation costs as cheap as possible, even if they are fighting for 50 euros less. So the actual expenses for a company incorporation are about 800 euros. It can be a bit cheaper if you go for the slow route, because you can incorporate a company with a slow government process, but you can also incorporate a company with a fast track process where the government just reviews your documents and application much faster. And so you will see offers that range between 800 to, let's say, 1,000 euros, where you think, that is quite cheap. But these offers most of the time don't include the following services, and those are the VAT registration of your Cyprus company, because if you're operating within Cyprus or other EU companies, you need to register for VAT. Then there is also the UBO registrar, or the transparency register, which you also need to file your documents to declare who's the ultimate beneficial owner of the company, where you have to list all shareholders that own more than 25% of the company. Next is the social insurance registration, which is needed for every employee in the company. And this leads to the point that I mentioned earlier. It's not even possible to give you a quote for your company formation without knowing anything about your company, because it can be a huge multinational company with hundreds of employees, or you can be a solopreneur with just one employee in it. Then there's also the articles of association as well as the memorandum of association. It's basically the two most important documents for your company. And every company ideally needs a bank account in order to operate, receive and send money from. And here the costs for that range between 200 to, let's say, also 1,000 euros, because there are various different options where you can open a bank account, and it also depends on your business activity. If you're in a high risk industry, like let's say adult industry or iGaming industry or Forex, then it is much harder to open a bank account, because you need to understand the banks as well. They have a very strong KYC and AML process, and in order to open up a bank account, you need to provide various different documents, and obviously you can also do it yourself. Like Revolut or Wise, they have a very easy onboarding process where you just need to provide your passport, the memorandum of association, and your company incorporation certificates, the shareholder certificates, registered address, and those kinds of things. So when it comes to neobanks, you can definitely do it yourself. But when it comes to local banks, then you definitely want to have a partner that is able to open up your bank account much faster without friction and not getting endless email communication with the bank compliance officers because they want more and more documents. But the next point is the registered office address, and this is actually very much the same for most service providers. They charge something around 800 euros per annum, meaning every company needs a registered office address where you receive letters, for example, but this is not your trading address, and this is why it is very much recommended to use a registered office address that you're not regularly changing, because to change the registered office address costs 100-200 euros, and so a lot of service providers just offer their clients to use the address of the accountant or the lawyer or the service provider, and this costs 800 euros per year. And then this is where it's getting a little bit sketchy, because a lot of service providers, lawyers, accountants offer you a secretary service where they put themselves in the position of being the secretary, and they say that they do various different communication work for you to communicate with the government, the semi-government bodies, or the banks. And so they charge an additional about 800 euros for the secretary position. And when it comes to the director position, then we are looking at prices of 12,000 euros per year. Why is that? Because in order to be a legal director of a company, you technically need to receive the minimum salary in Cyprus, and that is, as of the time of recording this video, 1,000 euros per month. So a lot of service providers try to sell you the director position, even though you might not even need it. And what is the director position? It is basically the most important position in a company. It is definitely a part of the board as well. And the director is the most responsible person in a company. So if your company, for whatever reason, has a legal problem, for example, the director is the person that will need to take care of this, and that is also personally liable for any damages that might occur. But if you are relocating to Cyprus yourself, you do not need a directorship service. You might not even need the secretary service, because you can be the director and the secretary at the very same time if you are the sole shareholder of the company, meaning you're the only one in the company that owns 100% of the shares of that Cyprus limited company. But we see it again and again where clients come to us and they are unhappy with their service providers, and then we look at their structure and we find out that they have a local director in Cyprus, even though they are a tax resident of Cyprus themselves. But most of these clients, they don't understand what they are even signing up for, what they are paying for, and this is where the service providers are taking advantage of this non-existing knowledge, and they just sell services telling the clients that they need it, even though this is not really the case. But that's about that. There's also the nominee services, which we don't offer because it is literally unnecessary nowadays with the UBO. A nominee structure is not really working anymore. But when you add all of those numbers together, then we are looking at a company incorporation price of 2,000 euros, something around that, depending on your individual case. And so the 1,000 euros for the company incorporation, which a lot of service providers are advertising, is most of the times not really the case. Because yes, they can incorporate a company for you for 800 euros, but then you are missing so many on the other services that you do need for operating that company, such as the VAT registration and all the other things that I mentioned. And then they are going to charge you for those services later on, because you need to understand the service providers know what they are doing. They want you to be a client of them, and then once they did the onboarding, they got all of your documents, they know that it is quite hard to change your service provider, and so they just advertise with cheap prices, and over a period of 1, 2, 3 years you're going to pay the exact same as if you were to go with a more expensive service provider that literally is not expensive. He's just charging you the costs in the beginning instead of various different smaller invoices. In general, you can remember, the more invoices you get from your service providers, the more likely they just squeeze you as much as they can. And this leads to the accounting and bookkeeping, which is exactly the same case. I would even argue it's worse. The accountants really know how to make money from their clients. And so the accounting and bookkeeping, yeah, we can charge you 1,000 euros, 1,100 euros as well. But I'm telling you, there is no accounting service in Cyprus for this amount, because there's also payroll services, which costs about 30 euros per employee as well, because every employed person from a Cyprus limited company also receives salary, but a lot of businessmen, a lot of entrepreneurs pay themselves additional income where they just need some money on top from the company. So I just pay from my business bank account to my private bank account, and all those things is work for the accountant, because he's receiving data entries, and every single additional row is more work for him. And I'm telling you that he's going to charge you for that. He's not doing the work for free. The same goes for the monthly VS return, which is 100 to 200 euros per month. The VS filing is reporting to the Cyprus tax authorities anything that is going on in your company, all income that you receive from EU companies or that you are sending to EU companies. So basically your trading activities need to be reported latest by the 15th of the next month. So now we have September. If September ends, I need to provide all my trading activities, income and expenses to the Cyprus tax authorities until 2 weeks into the next month. Then there is a similar but different process, which is the VAT return. This is quarterly, where you also have to provide all of your income and expenses, including all bank transfers, including all VAT income that you generated. And this is another 100 to 200. Then there is obviously also the proactive management. And what does that mean? Because you can have an accountant that does your accounting, but you can also have an accountant that does your accounting. Meaning, I can just have a connection to your Xero bookkeeping or Zoho bookkeeping software, whatever you're using, and I just take all of the information that you send to me and we provide it to the registrar here in Cyprus. But what we can also do is we can review your tax declarations. We can also give you proactive recommendations how you can minimize your liable corporate tax that you have to pay. We also have to tell you all of the various different deadlines for this payment, for that payment, and whatever there is, so that you don't face penalties. And then obviously this can be done by a junior accountant or a senior advisor that is in the business for multiple decades. And it is very important to understand that, because remember, accountants and advisors and auditors and lawyers, they all don't work for free. And if they know that they are good, they are going to charge you a little bit more probably, but for that, if you save thousands or tens of thousands of euros because they give you some tips on how you can create some additional business expenses, or they reply to your questions immediately and not after the weekend because they don't work over Saturdays and Sundays, which is very common here in Cyprus, then you slowly understand the difference between a low quality service, which might be cheap, and a high quality service, which is a little bit more expensive, but definitely worth it because it saves you money. And we are not talking about candies here, where you just want to get the cheapest candy possible. We are talking about your business here, where you want to work with professionals, because as soon as you miss one deadline, and I've seen that hundreds of times, then the money that you have to pay for the penalty sometimes goes up into the thousands, and there is no high quality service provider that is going to be so expensive where it is worth going to the cheap provider, where you have to face these hidden costs, uncomfortable conversations, weird interactions, and not a clean accounting. And also, most of the times, the proactive management, the things that I just mentioned, are free of charge anyways for many good service providers. And so that leads to ineffective accounting costs somewhere around 1,500 euros to 2,000 euros, depending on which service provider you're working with, and also obviously depending on the business transactions that you have in your company, the volume of invoices that you send out, invoices that you receive. Basically, how big your company is a very important factor for how much work the accountants have and how much you're effectively going to pay for your bookkeeping. So with that being said, let's go to the auditing, which is the third corporate service that is essential, and that includes the preparation and submission of various different audits. There is, for example, the annual return HE32. This is the filing of your accounts to the Cyprus registrar, and it is actually included in most accounting services, but still other service providers charge an additional 100 to 200 euros for that. Then we have the corporate tax return, which is for your Cyprus limited company, which is basically around 1,100 to 2,000 euros in most cases, even though 2,000 euros is on the higher end. But if you're running an e-commerce store with hundreds, if not thousands of transactions per year, then you can definitely have a price of that, but most companies don't have that. And then there is the IR7, the TD1, which is basically the personal tax declaration for you as a natural person. In previous years, the TD1 was optional only if you make more than 19,500 euros per year as a Cyprus tax resident, but they changed it to making it obligatory or mandatory for every Cyprus tax resident. So this is an additional cost for every Cyprus tax resident of 150 euros. So for the auditing, you can expect a very similar price like the accounting, which is 1.5 to 2k euros per year, and also per Cyprus company, obviously. Now, that is about it for the corporate services, the most important ones. We are also discussing some other vehicles in a second, but first I wanted to mention the residency permit for EU citizens, which is effectively the yellow slip. Many people know it. In order to stay in Cyprus for more than 90 days and work from here, you need to apply for the yellow slip, which is the temporary residency as in the books of Cyprus, but it is an eternal temporary residency, meaning it is effectively a permanent residency because every EU citizen can stay and live in any EU member country for however long they want. So the yellow slip includes the tax ID registration for the TIC, the tax identification code or number, which every natural person needs for various different things like opening up a bank account. They're always asking you for your tax identification number, and this is what you need. So the costs for the yellow slip are around 800 euros. The real costs at the immigration office, the costs that the lawyer has to pay as well, are around 200 to 300 euros. The tax ID registration is around 150 euros. And then, as you most likely also will work here in Cyprus, either for another company or your own Cyprus limited company, then you also need to be registered with social insurance and YESI, which is about 150 euros. These smaller fees, like 50 to 150 euros, are all one-off costs that you will have, and for the service providers, these are costs of about 30 euros that they have to pay for the government services, either online or in the various different offices and registrars and whatever there is, where they just have to apply for you in your name, and then they will prepare all of the documents, and there is a processing fee of 30 euros, something around that. And then in some cases, there are also individuals that are interested in special visas, like the digital nomad visa, for example. Then there are various different costs which we can advise you in an individual consultation call, just because there are so many different ones, but all of these are costs of max 1,000 euros. So we are really not an expensive country. Cyprus is really cheap if we compare it to other countries like the UAE or even Germany, where a company incorporation can easily cost 10,000 euros just in legal and professional services, and accounting is a few thousand euros. Then we are definitely looking at a very affordable jurisdiction here. And as this was for European citizens, we are also going to quickly look at non-European citizens. They basically have the pink slip. It is effectively the same as the yellow slip, and because it is very similar, the costs here are also the same, 800 euros. But most non-European entrepreneurs, investors and families are actually interested in the PR, which is also called the golden visa here in Cyprus, which will also grant Schengen access soon. The PR is tied to an off-plan property investment of at least 300,000 euros. As of the time of recording this video, if Cyprus enters Schengen, this minimum investment will most likely be higher than that. I'm looking at a price of 400,000 to 500,000 euros. This is what I can definitely see as realistic, because the government obviously also wants to take advantage of that, because they are making money from this investment via the VAT that needs to be paid on every new property that you buy. But the legal fees of a PR application is somewhere around 2,000 euros for the lawyer costs, so 2,000 euros for the lawyer, And then there's also a 500 euros government fee for the application, and potentially a courier service which costs around 100 euros, where your documents need to be apostilled if you're not in Cyprus, in the country, as of the time for the application, because you are still in your home country and you want to apply for the PR from there without coming and flying here. It is definitely possible. Then there will be a small courier charge, but if you're buying a property for at least 300,000 euros, I think the 100 euros don't even matter. And so these are the costs for the residency permits in Cyprus, and this leads also to the very popular non-dom status, which is basically a certificate from the Cyprus tax authorities where you are exempt from the special defense contribution, which means you will not pay any dividends or interest income tax for the next 17 years if you fulfill the requirements of being a Cyprus tax resident under the 183 days rule or the 60 days rule, and the non-dom registration with the tax authorities are just 800 euros. And a very interesting thing here is that I actually recommend as many entrepreneurs to just apply for the non-dom, even though you're not looking to relocate to Cyprus in the near future, just because it is such a powerful non-dom status. It is probably the best non-dom program in the EU, and it lasts for 17 years. And once you receive the non-dom certificate, it is stamped and certified by the Cyprus tax authorities, a EU member country, then you can also become a legal tax resident in, let's say, 5 years from now. But 800 euros for just the option and freedom of becoming a Cyprus tax resident under the non-dom and paying 0% dividend and interest income tax is definitely powerful, because you never know, maybe you are interested in relocating to Cyprus in a few years from now. And now it's time for a little conclusion, because those were the most important services that are relevant for most entrepreneurs that are interested in either setting up a Cyprus company or actually physically relocating to Cyprus, because we now discussed the company incorporation, accounting, auditing, the residency permit, as well as the non-dom certificate. And here, what we do at Tax.one is we charge a package price, which is around 5,000 euros. And what we do, which is different to most other service providers, is we charge this price upfront, and then we are not issuing any further invoices for the next 12 months. But what most competitors do is they charge you 1,100 euros. And in your mind, you're thinking, okay, 1,100 euros is 5 times less than 5,000 euros, so they are cheaper. But then you're receiving all of these smaller invoices within the next few months. And then you might end up with an even higher price than 5,000 euros, especially if you missed deadlines, if your accountants are not advising you properly on how you have to properly do your accounting. And also, you need to talk to 3 different bodies here. That is a lawyer for the company incorporation, an accountant for the accounting, and then also an external auditor, and you're talking to 3 different companies, having email exchanges with all of them, just because you went to the most cheap service provider for every individual service. And this is exactly why I said earlier, it doesn't make sense in this world to look at the cheapest prices and pick and choosing what is the cheapest. Oh, they are charging 800 euros for a non-dom, they 700, so I'm working with them on the non-dom, but they are cheaper on that service, so I'm working with them on that. It doesn't make sense, because I'm telling you, no matter who you work with, the prices will be effectively the same. Even if you work with the big 4, even though they will definitely be more expensive, the benefit of working with such companies that basically are a one-stop shop and they have in-house lawyers, accountants, auditors, the benefit of them is you just have minimal work from your side. They tell you exactly what you have to do. You're talking to one person, and this person is your contact of trust. You know exactly who you have to contact whenever you have any issues. You know who's responsible if there are any problems that occur in your legal work, in your accounting, in your whatever it is that you're doing as a business. And so I'm telling you, as a person that came to Cyprus as a client and now transitioned into a service provider, it doesn't really make sense. I've been in your shoes, now I'm in the shoes of the service provider, and I'm telling you how it works behind the scenes. We could also charge the cheapest prices, but this is more work from our side. We want to build a relationship with our clients. We don't want to work with clients that are basically fishing the cheapest prices and they don't value our time and our work as well, because you need to understand, it is the business of the service providers as well. And they understand if you are just going for the cheapest prices. So this is also not good for a relationship building. So that's about that. I really want to be as transparent as possible on this channel. I hope you appreciate that. If you do, definitely make sure to subscribe to the channel, because we are doing more videos like that in the future where we help you pay as little tax as legally possible. And now let's discuss some more services that are relevant to a lot of entrepreneurs, maybe even you, because some countries require you, if you leave your home country, to provide a tax certificate of your new tax residency country. And for that, we need to issue a tax certificate of Cyprus, which costs 150 euros, which you can then show to your home country. Then also, actually very funny, some service providers charge you for the KYC onboarding. And this leads back to the point where you also have to understand the side of the service providers, because in order to collect all of your documents, it costs quite some time and energy, because it is not just as simple as your passport and your previous tax declarations. This can also be documents where we have to communicate with your advisors from your home country, because some banks require to basically issue a certificate of good standing, for example, where we have to communicate with your lawyers and accountants what it is exactly that Cyprus banks require, which needs to be stated on the documents. And all that is working time from professionals, which some of the service providers even charge with a blended hourly rate of 150 euros, for example, which we don't do at Tax.one. This is a part of our full package, but I'm just telling you, if you're going with another service provider, which you are more than welcome to do, then this is something where you easily pay up to 500 euros. And then when it comes to cross-border transactions, the OSS applies, which is the one-stop shop. It is relevant for accounting where you exceed thresholds in other countries of selling goods, services and products. This is an additional charge on the accounting. It can be plus 50 euros for the accounting. Then we have the IP box regime and the trust. Let's start with the IP box regime. So the IP box regime in Cyprus effectively reduces your corporate tax to as little as 2.5%. For that, we are using a formula which includes qualified income and qualified expenses, so that we can then calculate your effective corporate tax. And again, it is somewhere in the range from 2.5% to 12.5% or 15% if Cyprus launches their 15% corporate tax. And the professional fees for setting up the IP box is 3,000 to 5,000 euros, which includes the levy to the government. And here there are two options how we can apply or set up your IP box regime, and that is the slow process or the normal examination of your application, which is the slow process. And then there is also the fast examination of your application, which costs 2,000 euros in real expenses for the service providers. And this leads to an actual cost of 3,000 to 5,000 euros. Also, we will have to review a lot of individual documents regarding your intellectual property to find out if you're even eligible and all that. So the costs for that are, let's say, 3 to 5K. But this is a one-off cost. Then we have the Cyprus Trust, which is also a very, very powerful and popular vehicle, not just for Cyprus tax residents, but also for foreigners that take advantage of the benefits of the Cyprus Trust, which is basically that ownership to assets are settled into a trust, and after 2 years, the trust owns the assets, which can be properties, cars, even cash, crypto, anything you own as an asset. And then you will assign beneficiaries, which are your kids, for example, and then the beneficiaries of the Cyprus Trust will receive all of the assets inside of the Cyprus Trust at 0% inheritance tax, because the Cyprus Trust is a vehicle that bypasses any local inheritance and or probate laws, rules and taxes, which is one of the most powerful vehicle for high net worth individuals. And in order to set up a trust professionally, it needs to be drafted and filed with certain regulators here in Cyprus. That can be the Cyprus Bar Association or the Cyprus Security and Exchange Commission or the Institute for Cyprus Accountants or even the new Cyprus Trust Registry. The costs for that are around 3,000 to 5,000 euros. This cost is for the setup, and then there is an additional charge for the administration, which is 5,000 to 7,000 euros, but this depends on the total value of all assets in the Cyprus Trust. And so you see, the Cyprus Trust is definitely a rather more expensive vehicle, but this is mainly for high net worth individuals that own assets that are worth at least €500,000. Less than that, it's not worth to have a Cyprus Trust, and it is also a special clientele. It's mostly older people that are looking for wealth protection, asset protection. It is not for upcoming entrepreneurs and startups. It's more for people that already made their money. Then the Cyprus Trust also needs a bank account where you can expect costs of €500 for the assistance in opening up a bank account, because it is not as easy as opening it with a Cyprus company. Then there is the annual trustee fee, which again depends on the asset's value. This is effectively the administration fee. So you will assign a trustee, which is the middleman between you as the settler and the beneficiaries that receive the assets. And this can be a natural person, but in many cases it is an additional company that is going to be called the trustee company, where the costs are basically the same as we looked earlier, which is 1,100 euros. Not, but when you open up a Cyprus Trust, then you will definitely get a good offer from your service providers. And then where are we? We are here. Then there is trust. We discussed that. Amendments, what does that mean? Once you open up a Cyprus company, there will be changes. You will change the secretary, director, shareholders, registered office address, various different things that will occur, contracts, all of that. And these amendments costs about 100 to 200 euros, which is much cheaper. I also have a UAE free zone company, and such amendments there are easily 5 times the price. And then finally we have consulting, advisory and support. Because if we look at the big four again, most of the revenue that PwC, KPMG, Deloitte and Ernst & Young are earning is coming from advisory. Because if you want to have the most tax efficient international structure, then this needs expertise. You cannot just open up a Cyprus limited company and expect to have the best advisor possible. You will work with the local accountant and lawyer, but this is totally fine unless you run a big business. Then you definitely want to work with professionals, and this is also our philosophy at Tax.one. We are a boutique firm when it comes to tax advisory. We have international tax advisors that advise you on structures with the UAE and Malta and Cyprus, being a tax resident in Cyprus, leveraging companies in other jurisdictions, and doing that while staying compliant with all international tax law. But this is not what this video is about. It would be way too long. If you're interested in that, definitely make sure to subscribe to the channel and also watch our other videos. Now finally, we are just going to discuss the ongoing annual expenses. As mentioned, many of the expenses are one-off fees, such as the incorporation, application and registrations, all that. But what is ongoing is the secretary and director, if you have one. If you're not living in Cyprus, you most likely have a directorship service, but this is something we can definitely look into in your individual case. The registered office address, it just makes sense to have it at your service provider's office, because you know that he will not move offices, whereas if you put it on your Airbnb that you're going to change in 3 months from now, you will pay 100 to 200 euros in order to change the address. So just go with the registered office. Then you obviously have social insurance and YESI contributions depending on your personal income and dividends that you're receiving. Then there are also the accounting fees and audit fees, which are ongoing, and the taxes that you will pay. And those were the most important costs when it comes to Cyprus. I try to be as detailed, accurate and transparent as possible. I literally talked about everything that I know of living and operating in Cyprus under Tax.one for almost 5 years now. So if you appreciate those kinds of videos, definitely make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you do so, I will see you in the next video.